I am a person who intends to live a life of love. And this love theme is central to many of the religious traditions. I would argue all of the major religious traditions, although in some religions it plays a greater role than others. And outside of religion, you could be a humanist and think that love is supreme. My personal goal is to be a loving person in all dimensions of my life. And so I thought, what would it look like to make an argument for panpsychism from love? And so my thesis for this particular presentation is this: panpsychism provides a a rationale for grounding the essential claims about love. And when I say essential claims about love, I have initially in mind 5 or 6 of them, but given the time we have today, I've decided to narrow those down to 2 in particular. First claim, including the value claims in and the experience of love. And secondly, the evolutionary emergence of lovers themselves. So that's going to be my main thesis. What I want to do to get to that thesis is kind of start broadly and talk about some terminological things and then move down into my argument and hopefully do that within 25 minutes. Trip, if you wouldn't mind, when I have about 5 minutes left. If I haven't stopped by that time, go ahead and interrupt. So the argument for panpsychism from love, especially 2 particular elements: the value claims and the experience of love, and this idea of the evolutionary emergence of love. I think it's helpful to get straight on the terminology that I'm going to be using. It might not be the terminology that the rest of you use, but just so you understand where I'm coming from my presentation. The word panpsychism is probably the most used. It's not a word I particularly like for what we're talking about in this mind and nature. And the reason I don't particularly like panpsychism is that I don't think the word in and of itself accounts well for what I think is a fundamental aspect of the ontological structures of reality. That is, the physical or material dimensions of existence. When I'm talking with someone in the academy or even on the street and I use that word panpsychism, they don't get the impression that there's anything other than psyche. All is psyche. And I think we need to talk seriously about the material and physical dimension of existence. That word in and of itself, at least in my thinking, doesn't do a very good job of that. David Ray Griffin coined the word pan-experientialism to get at what I think we're trying to work at today. And I think that word rightly points to the idea that experience is fundamental, but it doesn't account for either the mental or the physical dimensions, which I think is really important in this discussion. Because so often, as you all know, this discussion comes down to questions of mind-body, how the two interact, how we understand the world around us, having interiority, but also having some kind of physicality, some kind of materiality. Some today like to use the word dual aspect monism. And the positive nature of that, of course, is that it's talking about 2 things right in the title. There are 2 aspects of this that are one thing. The problem, in my way of thinking, is that we don't get any idea what those aspects are from the label. So I have come up with my own little label that I like to use in the discussion that, at least in my way of thinking, puts it right up front what we're talking about when we talk about mind and nature, or panpsychism. That is material mental monism. This phrase, I think, points to the 2 fundamental dimensions of any existing thing, whether it's an individual or society. So I'm going to use material mental monism for much of my presentation today. As I think about panpsychism, typically the big question is how you understand not only my own experience, which seems very clearly to be one of interiority, mentality, consciousness, choice, agency, intentionality, all those kinds of things, but also understanding how that's true of a whole lot of other creatures and things on this planet. And the typical way of distinguishing between these existences is to talk about one category of thing as being organismic or animate, And that ranges anywhere from cells to civilizations. These are societies as in the way they're organized. And the opposite of being aggregates or inanimate societies. And those are rocks, water, skyscrapers, etc. In the discussion, of course, like many of you, people want to know, do rocks have minds? And the typical way we talk about that is to make this distinction between organismic and aggregates, or animate and inanimate. And then, of course, there's the especially interesting middle ground, or what I like to call the hybrids, the mixed societies. That would include especially things like plants, like you're seeing in the background there with those trees, which seem to have some aspects of them that are organismic, but other aspects that are aggregates. And I think especially interesting, the question of cyborgs, persons who have both what we typically think of as human characteristics, but also machine-like parts. Those seem to be a hybrid between organisms and aggregates. The other big issue in terms of our terminology, or at least for me, from my presentation, is what we mean by the big L word. What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. So what do we mean by love? Well, that's been defined a bunch of different ways over the centuries. One classic way is to talk about love as desire. That's usually associated with Plato. Here the question is, what do you desire? What is rightly desired? You can have misguided or improper desires, or proper or guided desires. Some talk about love in terms of what you freely do or what you're intending to do. There's been a recent resurgence in the notion of, or the essential nature of relationality in love, which I affirm. Some think about love primarily as an emotion. If you look at the psychological research, oftentimes the psychologist just thinks of love as one of the emotions a person has, or a kind of affection that's that comes about by various means. I think that's especially important to talk about love in terms of well-being and values. In fact, I think that's the way most religious traditions think about love. Not that they dismiss desire, intentionality, relationality, all those things. But when I think about the great texts in the various theological and non-theological religious traditions, most often this word love has to do with well-being, some kind of blessedness, abundant life. You get that in bhakti and karuna. You get that in hesed, agape, all these kinds of words that many of you are familiar with. And the big question, of course, at least in the literature of religion, is, does God play some kind of role in love? Some people just think God is love, and they mean by that any loving action must be God acting in the world, and therefore discount any creature reaction. So there's a bunch of possibilities there. I could talk for a long time on each of them, but here's my definition of love on the table for you. I think to love has three aspects. First of all, it's some kind of intentional action. Second of all, it's some kind of relational response to others, and I'm a theist. I think God is a part of that mix, but not the only part of that mix. And I think love's aim is to promote well-being. If you think about that definition carefully, you'll see that all of the elements I've already mentioned can be fit into this particular definition. So when I talk about love from this point forward, I have this in mind: acting intentionally in response to others, including God, to promote overall well-being. You're probably already thinking ahead to my big questions and thinking that I've sort of baked in my answers to my definition of love. I don't think that's sort of cheating in any way. I think this particular definition of love could be widely accepted amongst academics and the typical person on the street. But I just want to be upfront that as I move forward, this way of thinking about love is going to be central. So that's my terminology. Here are the two questions then that I want to address in the remaining time I have as they relate to material mental monism and panpsychism in particular. First question is this: if love seeks to promote well-being, how can we account for the experience of well-being that seems necessary in the beloved? That is, if love is truly about promoting the values, the goodness, the abundant life, the blessedness, something positive in the one who is love, how can we account for this in terms of this well-being? And secondly, how would individuals who are capable of this kind of intentional action to promote well-being, how would those individuals emerge in an evolutionary history? The two big questions that I want to address from this point forward. So, to answer this first one, that is, if love seeks to promote well-being, how can we account for the experience of well-being in the beloved? I think we need to begin by noting that the very common claim that evolutionary history shows a gradual emergence of more complex creatures, and if this is true about mentality, those creatures seem to have more complex mental capacities. The capacities for mentality in the human seems greater than an elephant. An elephant seems greater than a cat. Cat seems greater than a mouse, etc., etc. So there's some kind of emergence of greater complexity in the evolution of in evolutionary history. Then the argument would be that positing an element of mentality in existing beings allows us to say that even the simpler entities of existence have some measure of experience, some measure, some modicum of experience, and that even they can enjoy value. So this is the pan in panpsychism, that everything has some kind of experiential capacity. And it's pretty obvious when I think to most of us, if we start with complex beings like you and me, humans, we can love other humans in the sense of enhancing their well-being. How about dogs? I think so. I try to love my dog. It seems to be enhanced in its well-being. It seems to experience my love. Mice, I don't have any problem with that. Amoeba, I don't even have any problem with that, even down to cells. When it gets down to quarks, I must admit it's harder for me to imagine that a quark can experience well-being. At this point, I think the regularities of existence at the very simple levels make it much harder for the panpsychist to point to some kind of activity at that level that gives a strong indication of experience. By hypothesis, of course, the panpsychist or the material mental monist wants to say that even quarks have experience. So I've at least got probably down there. However, it seems to me that we can't love rocks. That is, rocks don't experience well-being. My attempts to do them good can't be enjoyed by rocks, qua rocks in and of themselves. Perhaps their smallest individual parts, but not them as a whole. And that would be the same for computers and even robots. As much as robots have indication of complexity, if we think they are comprised of simpler entities that don't have the organismic and complexity of societies, we couldn't love robots in the sense of enhancing their well-being. We can, however, as I mentioned, perhaps love the individuals that make up these aggregates. Probably so at that level. What about plants? I think we can love plants, at least those aspects of the plants that are organismic. If I chop down a tree, if the center of the tree is an aggregate, I can't love or not love it, but perhaps there are aspects of the leaves or the bark or some parts that are organismic that can experience my love or not. And of course, many of us know these research data that talk about how plants can respond to positive vibes, singing, all that kind of thing. What about cyborgs? I think we can love cyborgs in the sense of those aspects of the cyborgs that are organismic. If Philip Clayton decides he's going to replace one of his arms with a gun that can fire at his enemies, because he's all about violence, I can still love Philip Clayton as the person, but the aspect of his arm that it's a machine, I wouldn't say I love it because it can't experience my endeavors to increase well-being. So that's my answer to the first question. Let me now move to the second question in this material mental monism issue. How would individuals capable of acting intentionally to promote well-being have ever emerged in evolutionary history? Here, I think, again, evolutionary history shows this gradual emergence with more complex mentality. And while we don't need to think that quarks and cells are conscious, positing some aspect of mentality, even in them, that over time complexifies by organizing in various ways, can allow for what I like to call a smooth emergence of creatures capable of intentional actions. That word smooth emergence is meant to distinguish the idea of we might call a strong emergence, from which mentality emerges in more complex creatures when previously there was no mentality at all at less complex creatures. Then, of course, we ask the questions. Can humans love by acting intentionally? It seems very obvious that we are intentional creatures. What about dogs? Well, they seem to act intentionally. We can't know for sure, but we watch their actions. Mice, probably so. Amoeba, here I'm starting to get doubtful when we get to the lower levels. Not doubtful that there's mentality, but doubtful that we can use words like intentionality amongst the smallest members of society. If love involves some kind of intentionality, I'm not sure quarks can love. I'm kind of doubtful they can. But because there's a measure of mentality, according to mental monism, at the quarks level, when the complexity reaches a particular point, full-blown intentionality can emerge in evolutionary history. So, my conclusion, panpsychism, or what I like to call material mental monism, fits a story that describes reality saying, number one, beings of varying complexities exist, and love can enhance their well-being. We can love and enhance the well-being of even very small entities of reality. Number two, the capacity for acting intentionally to promote well-being increased gradually in evolutionary history as increasingly complex beings emerged in the evolutionary history of our universe. This means, in conclusion, if my PowerPoint will work correctly, there we go. Material mental monism or panpsychism provides a rationale to say that my aim to live a life of love means that I can and should love not only humans, but also love other creatures, even the simpler beings that exist. And I can promote the well-being of all creatures, great and small. Thanks.